Vandana Singh and Shomona Khanna with us, who will be discussing the urgent theme of ecological shifts and perspectives. We come to ecology with the recognition that the times we are in are making especially clear the impact that our capitalism-centric ways of life have had on the environment. And nonetheless, we are seeing the government push through environmental clearances for development projects speedily at the moment, with the lockdown providing little room for visible dissent. In this conversation, we would also want to explore the interconnections or interdependencies between the human and the non-human, and perhaps connecting those with the indigenous worldviews. Uh, to introduce our speakers today, our first speaker would be Vandana Singh. Vandana Singh is a physicist and a writer who was born and raised in New Delhi, and she currently lives in United States near Boston. Zuban has published 4 of her books, and her short stories have appeared in numerous venues and several Best of Year anthologies, including the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. She's the author of the ALA notable book Young Uncle Comes to Town and a previous short story collection, The Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet and Other Stories, which was published by Zuban and Penguin. Our second speaker of the day would be Shomona Khanna, who is an advocate working on the rights of Adivasis and forest dwellers and has published several books and articles on the subject. She has also set up the Legal Resource Center, a collective of lawyers and experts working on the issue of Adivasi rights in India. Besides this, she has also worked closely on the issues of sexual harassment at workplace and edited a book written by Indira Jaising on the subject. The rules, I think most of you must have received them in your email, but I'll be reading a few of them out, which we think are really pertinent. Uh, so, uh, 1 minute. We are not going to tolerate any racist, Islamophobic, or any other hate speech. And any participants using such speech will be removed from the webinar without warning. And if, we would also encourage people to log in using their names which they have signed up with for these webinars. And other than that, I can't think of anything really necessary for the moment. So I would like to invite Vandana to start with her talk. Hi Vandana, so now it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Any problems with sound or anything else, just put it in the chat box, please. All right, so thank you again, and thank you to everyone who's here. I'm going to start with an exercise that's purely optional. If you feel like indulging me, please do. I'm going to ask people who are willing to take some breaths, not that you have much of a choice, but take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. And as we take in these breaths, I want us to acknowledge the cycles to which we are indebted, the cycles of nature. So for instance, when we take a breath in and the oxygen in the air keeps us alive, we are indebted to green plants, to oceans everywhere, to the phytoplankton in the oceans, to the forests, and to microorganisms that lived 2.5 billion years ago and gave us our oxygen-rich atmosphere. And then as we take in another breath and breathe out, our exhalation is rich in carbon dioxide. And if that's all that was going on, that animals were breathing carbon dioxide out, it would accumulate in the atmosphere and the earth would be much hotter, much faster, because we know that carbon dioxide is a warming gas. What is it that maintains the temperature that we've enjoyed for such a long time, thousands and thousands of years? Well, it is the carbon cycle. It is the fact that there are things that draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, like green plants, like the ocean. So we are indebted to all of these systems. And thirdly, if we take one more mindful breath here and acknowledge the matter of which we are made, the matter of which we are made, a key element of life is nitrogen. Our atmosphere is largely nitrogen, and yet in that form, it's unusable. So we owe it to certain plants and microorganisms that convert that nitrogen into forms that we can use. And that form, nitrogen is part of our DNA, part of our protein molecules and all of that. So as we take these breaths, we acknowledge that our indebtedness to other life forms, to cycles of nature. So having started with that, I'd like to just share a few slides, and I'm going to talk very fast because I'm going to try to keep within 15 minutes as much as possible. So I'm going to, and I do warn you that I'm an academic, so we do tend to talk, but I promise to try to keep it as limited as possible with a view to the time. So, of course, this is a picture of the famous Wangari Maathai, one of my heroes. And what I want to show you is basically, we are right now in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. So how do we make sense of that and how do we connect to other things? Well, right now, we don't know exactly how COVID-19 originated, except that we do know that it did not originate in a lab. So instead of talking directly about that, I'm going to talk about zoonotic diseases in general. And these are diseases that jump from animals to humans. And I'm going to talk about one that started in Karnataka in the 1970s. And yes, they don't all start in China. They can pretty much start anywhere. And I'm sure most people in the room already know that scientists are making correlations between the destruction of forests, between agricultural livestock production, and the emergence of zoonotic diseases. In fact, of about 75% of the pathogenic diseases that we have today are actually from jumping from animals to humans. So it seems that destruction of forests, increased contact between animals and humans, and potentially even lowered immune systems of animals under stress can cause pathogens to mutate in ways that are not good for us. So now, one of the things I do in academia, I'm a physicist, but one of the things I do is to look at climate change and climate science in the context of justice issues. And there are some commonalities between the two problems that we are talking about, climate change and zoonotic diseases are both rooted in the human relationship with nature, where I'm going to put human in quotes, as you'll see in a moment. And so this picture, for instance, embraces both things. This is a picture of open cast coal mining in Hasdeo Arand forest. And deforestation is a major factor in climate change, and as we know, also in zoonotic disease. So this is one of the things that relates these two major issues that we are having. So one of the things that I want to do is to be true to the topic of this, this series, which is about the crisis of care. So one of the things that I use as a teaching tool in my classes, when I was looking at it recently, I realized that this teaching tool can also be thought of in the language of care, in the language of caring. So I'm going to share that with you. So here's the sun shining on our planet. And our planet, beautiful blue dots swimming in space, the land on which we stand, the air we breathe, the oceans, 70% of the surface area is ocean. And then the ice at the poles, which is an enormous climate impact. Also the ice in the Himalayas and other regions, and life itself. These five classifications that earth scientists make of the earth's subsystems are what interact to give us the environmental conditions we have. Now, more recently, some geologists have been saying that we need to add a sixth bubble, which they call the human impact or the anthroposphere, because human impact, as they put it, on environmental conditions on our planet is now at geological scale. I have a slight disagreement with that because I'd like to put the blame where it lies. And instead of blaming all humans, I want to put the point to the system in place. Now, the system can be called other things too. We'll talk about that in a moment. But modern industrial civilization has now a geological impact that is comparable to other systems, subsystems of the earth. And yet not all humans and not all human societies are implicated in the same way. So I put marginalized human groups separately from modern industrial civilization, although obviously they overlap. And these human groups include indigenous people, and they include people who do not have power in society, like the urban and rural poor. And so you can see that environmental justice is an issue, that climate justice is at the heart of the climate problem, because climate change affects everyone, but not everyone is equally to blame, and not everyone is equally impacted. So the other point that I want to raise here is that all of these subsystems interact with each other, and they interact complexly with each other. And depending on how they interact, they create conditions which may or may not be conducive for human life and or different kinds of human civilization. So the idea of planetary boundaries is something that is currently being debated and contested in academia. But basically the idea is that we owe our existence to natural cycles, and that if we don't recognize that, and if we don't keep within certain boundaries, then we are going to tip the Earth system into a state that may not support human civilization as we know it, or human life even. So with clustered or nested within the planetary boundaries is a space for multiple sustainable socio-ecological cultures, and whether their appearance means that this bubble at the bottom of modern industrial civilization is going to shrink or disappear, I'm not going to answer that because we don't know. So I use this as a teaching tool. And I want to relate these three themes of planetary boundaries, the idea of balance of the natural cycles that we talked about, and the idea of complex interactions between these systems. I want to recast it in the language of care. And how do we do that? Planetary boundaries imply restraint. And to restrain yourself is an act of caring. To restrain yourself from grabbing everything for yourself, for instance. The other thing, the idea of balance implies a kind of egalitarian give and take, that you recognize that others are involved. And then finally, the idea of complexity, complex interactions implies acknowledging interconnections and interrelationships and our interdependence. So having seen the big view here, what I'd like to focus on is that big fat bubble at the bottom, modern industrial civilization, and look at it structurally for a moment. Modern industrial civilization, if you want to call it neoliberal capitalism, you can do that. There are, of course, a whole lot of older things woven into it because inequality existed before capitalism. For instance, in the caste system. But all of these systems of inequality have an essentially pyramidal structure where you have the privileged, the rich, the wealthy, the powerful at the top, and then everyone comes below that. And at the bottom of the pyramid, you have the most marginalized people, the ones who are crushed the most by the system, including indigenous people, including the rural and urban poor, and also including non-humans. As you can see at the bottom of this painting, you have trees that are cut down and you have the bodies of animals. The horrible thing about this pyramid, or one of the many horrible things about it, is that if you are somewhere in the middle, okay, of this pyramid, then whether you like it or not, you're in a position that crushes the people and the non-humans below you. And you are kind of subservient to the ones above you. So that's one reason why our ethics and our actions and our lifestyles are so much at variance, because we are enmeshed in these systems which are pyramidal in structure. And this system demands, despite whatever egalitarianism is touted by modern industrial societies, the fact is that the system demands disposable people and disposable nature because its structure is inherently pyramidal. So, and I just randomly looked on the web today to look at how environment is being undermined, which I've been kind of watching since really 2014, although we know that it starts in the 1990s and then accelerates in 2014. But here are some pretty recent headlines from various newspapers, really showcasing what I said earlier, that at the bottom of the pyramid of power is the environment. So what I want to do is to try to make some connections between what we are seeing around the globe today, including in our country. We are seeing this in Brazil, we are seeing this in the US and so on, where a state that is becoming more authoritarian has certain relationships with large and powerful corporations. So let's see how this plays out. So as we can see, the authoritarian state essentially diverts resources, natural resources, to corporations. And corporations, in turn, powerful corporations, strengthen the authoritarian state. And this is a key codependent relationship that must be maintained at all costs. Now, what do citizens have to say about this? Now, in countries where there is some democratic machinery, when there are democratic essentials, these democratic essentials serve as checks, as we know, on the authoritarian state and on corporations. And by the way, I'm not saying anything new. I know most of you know this at a much more sophisticated level, but pictures help sometimes. So, because the democratic essentials serve as checks on these forces, they protect citizens and communities. Therefore, what's an authoritarian state to do? It must undermine those democratic essentials by suppressing dissent, by diluting environmental laws, and threatening academic freedom and muzzling the press. And at the same time, it must control and construct the reality by which citizens live through distraction and division. And one way that it does that is through the creation of internal enemies, and of course external enemies as well, as people have noted since Machiavelli and before. But internal enemies are particularly important now, whether it's Bolsonaro's Brazil, where he has essentially declared war on indigenous people, whether it's the question of Muslims in India, or Latinx migrants in the US, or whatever it is. We'll see why this is so essential and how it connects up with everything. So let's look at the right-hand end of this slide. Let's see what else corporations do here. What they do, of course, is to create the entire pyramid. They create the neoliberal socio-economic capitalist system, which is based on endless consumption. And that, of course, is what destroys what we call, so distantly called nature, which is directly linked to climate change, and also, as we see, to some of the newer pandemics. So now the thing is that what's an authoritarian state to do? You cannot let the public understand that this is what is going on. You cannot let them see the top part and the right-hand part of this slide. So what you do is you use your internal enemies to exacerbate fear, confusion, and division. The so-called internal enemies then become a convenient scapegoat for everything, including the pandemics, and essentially hiding the culpability of the authoritarian state corporation nexus. Now, this is not to say that the internal enemies are only a distraction. There's real hatred there. There's a real worldview there. There's a real attempt to manufacture a fake reality. In order to control the citizens and communities, and ultimately in order to divide them, so that a divided citizenry will not notice and will not question what's on the top of this slide and on the right-hand side. So this is a very basic kind of my attempt to portray these relationships. But what I want to concentrate on in the time that I have left is basically the way we think about things. So let's look at this slide. So when we look at events in isolation, we don't see the connections between them, and we become vulnerable to the state or whichever authority constructing our reality for us by interpreting those events in their own way. So we have to look underneath that to patterns of behavior over time. We have to look at history, for instance. We have to look at how things are connected through time and space, and what influences those patterns. And ultimately, at the bottom of this, we have to look at mental models or paradigms. You can think of paradigms as a framework through which we make sense of and construct our reality. So what are the values and assumptions and beliefs that shape the system? So cutting things very short, essentially, if you look at the framework of modern industrial civilization, and by the way, when I teach this stuff, there's a lot more that goes into it. I'm oversimplifying a little bit. One is that it's short-term thinking. We don't think about what's going to happen in 2100 to the planet because of climate change. The other is that we tend to think in linear terms. Our thinking is spatially limited as well. At the most, we might think about, well, okay, so I'm going to, so-and-so is getting married, they're going to a destination wedding in Italy and so on and so forth. But that's about as far as that goes, right? But the other thing which relates to our topic of a crisis of care is that our empathy, our empathic imagination is limited by the way that we are enculturated to construct reality. And we only think about our family, our friends, our class, our caste, our religion, and so on as being worthy of empathy. The other thing is that our cultures, modern cultures, are exclusively human-centered and disconnected from the rest of nature. And you can see that by the way that we have pushed out animals and birds from cities, but also how we have how we have not noticed when our forests are being cut down and our environment despoiled. So our delusion of separateness and independence from natural cycles. I mean, how many times do we think about what we owe our breath to? We don't typically. We are not taught to think like that. The other thing is belief in endless growth, in technological determinism, that technology is somehow going to solve everything, and the idea of progress, in quotes. And the insulation from consequences, which is, of course, a consequence of privilege, that you think that it's not going to hurt you and you're going to be fine. And that's not going to be true for terribly longer time. And of course, it's important to note that this way of thinking is not human nature. Well, it's part of human nature perhaps, but it's basically a consequence of enculturation into this paradigm of modern industrial civilization. And not all humans think or live this way. And the way that these paradigms fail us is because they don't fit the problem. Both COVID-19 and climate change are connected across space and time. So if you have sea ice melting in the Arctic, then how does that affect whether you have a drought or a heat wave in Delhi or Jharkhand? We don't think like that. And yet those connections are actually there. We depend on other species for our survival. Our economies depend on the health of our ecologies. Tell that to a mainstream economist who talks about everything else that matters as an externality. And also endless growth is not possible. And I can, if we had time, I'd give you a bunch of physics arguments about that. But anyway, that's for another talk, another time. So how do we unmoor ourselves from this paradigm of modern industrial culture? Because after all, paradigms often have unquestioned assumptions. These are our defaults. We don't think about them. And it turns out that the people who are most marginalized, the ones at the bottom of the pyramid, are the ones best placed to actually help us see, because they've never been part of the paradigm. They have been at the receiving end of all the horrors of this system. So indigenous people, for example, 5% of the world's population manage 80% of the world's biodiversity and nearly 300,000 million tons of carbon dioxide. And they die for this. They die defending their lands, and they die defending us, because we know that the more forests there are, the safer is our climate. So I want to acknowledge in particular this group of women in Jharkhand, whom I happen to be in an NGO that we work with, and we talked to them, we interviewed them last year. So the woman in the white and red sari has led this effort of village women, where they have regrown and protected and regenerated 200-hectare forest in their area of Jharkhand, and in a poor village, next to a poor village. And this forest, which was very degraded, has come to life again. And they have done things like patrol the forest, protect it from woodcutters and from the timber industry, and even from the forest department, and built mud check dams, dug holes for wildlife to have ponds for water, and so on and so forth. So they are my heroes. So as we think about social ecological systems of care, one of the things we do have to do is to learn from indigenous people. Now, I don't want to romanticize indigenous people. They're just as human as we are. And I certainly don't want to create any new pyramids here. But if you compare the environmental history of indigenous peoples with that of modern industrial civilization, it's not perfect, but they come out much better than we do. In 150 years, we've pretty much brought the earth to rack and ruin. So I'm going to end with yeah.
Sorry, I would just request you to wrap it up soon.
Yeah, this is my last slide. So I want to end with
Thank you.
Just tipping my hat to the power of the imagination, because after all, I am a fiction writer, and to point out a couple of things. One, that you can't just work on imagination, because imagination without engagement with the problems of society and of the environment is basically self-indulgence. And similarly, imagination without reflection and learning is not going to unmoor us from our default assumptions. And all of these three are necessary for effective action in the world. And my last line is actually a quote from one of my favorite poets, Sahir Ludhianvi. So I'm just going to put it out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vandana, for the wonderful talk. It was really informative. And now, like, without wasting any more time, we go over to Shomona. So, Shomona, it's all yours now.
Thank you so much, Vandana. That was lovely, actually. And thank you, Anuradha, and all my friends at Zuban for inviting me to be part of this webinar. It's a little difficult to kind of bring my own mind space to the law after such a poetic presentation by Vandana. But I think it is my responsibility as the lawyer to bring that legal part to it.
Shomona,
I
sorry, just like 1 minute. I just want to announce once again for everybody that any like quotes that you want to use in any social media post or news bits, please run it by us. And that's the please run it by us without before quoting our speakers anywhere at all. Thank you. Sorry, Shomona, please.
okay. Yeah. Just to briefly introduce the law here in this context that we're discussing today, is that it's important to recognize that the law relating to protection of the environment, to protection of the rights of Adivasis and forest dwellers and also other marginalized communities in India is very rich and is very complex. And one of the most important foundations that we have for our legal architecture is the Constitution itself, which actually has a very large number of provisions plus a very rich jurisprudence that has emerged from it relating to the rights of Adivasis, not just as individuals, but as communities over their homelands. In the Indian Constitution, these have been referred to as scheduled areas and have been scheduled under the fifth schedule and the sixth schedule of the Constitution. And there is a very complex and yet at the same time very sensible architecture of laws that protects the land rights, governance rights, and resource rights of Adivasi communities and also forest dwelling communities in these areas. At the time of the formulation of the Constitution, Jawaharlal Nehru spoke about the Panchil doctrine, in which he said that, among other things, he said that it's very important to recognize that Adivasi communities must be allowed to develop according to their own conscience and allowed to carry their rich traditions into what they determine is development. And these provisions in the law and in the Constitution have not fallen from the sky. It's important to recognize that they have emerged out of at least 150 years of tribal resistance in Adivasi areas, going back to the colonial state and even to some extent in the modern Indian post-independence state. So it's important to recognize that Adivasi lives and their culture is recognized and also closely tied to their constitutional status and their constitutional rights. There's a very important principle that I like to speak about whenever I get the opportunity, is the concept of substantive equality, which has been recognized as part of the fundamental rights chapter of our Constitution. And so in our Constitution, we don't recognize equality as being simply something which is formal in nature, as in everybody is equal before the law and can equally access whatever they want or can. But there is a recognition that in the Indian context, there has been historical discrimination against certain communities, Adivasi and indigenous communities being one of them. And therefore, there is a need to undo that historical injustice through affirmative action. And the courts in numerous judgments have recognized that providing special protections in the law, in the constitution, and in the administrative structures for Adivasi communities and for Adivasi homelands is not in any sense a sort of exception to the right to equality, but is an essential component of the right to equality, because it enhances the ability of India as a nation to become more egalitarian. Now, this is something that has emerged through many years of struggle, through numerous court processes and so on. It finds reflection in a number of legislations, such as the legislations which prevent alienation of tribal lands, in the enactment of the Panchayats Extension to Scheduled Areas Act and state level amendments, bringing that into fruition, and very importantly for us today, in the Forest Rights Act, which was enacted in 2006. The Forest Rights Act in its preamble recognizes very clearly that it is being brought into force to undo historical injustice. Now, this is one strand of the law. Some of you may be wondering, this is actually sounds quite unreal. And the reality is that there is also a very, very strong opposition to these processes within the law and within the constitution, within jurisprudential developments, which is, you know, in many ways, as Vandana also described it, coming through the authoritarian state, through corporate structures which have a codependent relationship with the state, and in the forest areas, which are primarily inhabited by Adivasi communities and forest dwellers, the force that is strongly resisting these developments and this growth is the Central Ministry of Ministry of Environment and Forests and Climate Change, now it is known as, and the state forest departments, which have, under a very oppressive colonial structure of forest law regime, have been very much in control of the forest areas, and for the longest time were actually probably, you know, they actually behaved as if the forests belong to them, whereas traditionally forests have been have belonged to indigenous communities. Now, these two processes go on at the same time, and as you can imagine, there has been a lot of resistance to the implementation of the Forest Rights Act, and the result of that, even according to official figures, is that as far as individual forest rights recognition is concerned, only around 10 to 12% of the potential rights have been recognized till today, although 14 years have passed since the enactment of the law. And as far as community forest resource rights are concerned, the percentage is very poor. Only 3% of the forest rights which could potentially have been recognized have actually been recognized today. Now, there are 2-3 very important things that have happened in recent years. Of course, from the 1990s onwards, there was a lot of push and pull in terms of the development of the law, but specifically after the enactment of the Forest Rights Act, there have been, it's not just been resistance and obstruction in terms of not allowing the law to be implemented properly, but there have been policy and legal changes that have been attempted to be brought on the ground to sort of dilute the Forest Rights Act, to in some ways sabotage it also. So one of the things that the Supreme Court, for instance, I'll just give you a few examples. We don't have time to go into details, but for instance, the Supreme Court in the Niyamgiri judgment has held that before diverting a forest area under the Forest Conservation Act, it's important to obtain Gram Sabha consent. The Gram Sabha's consent to this decision is very important. Until that decision has been obtained, there cannot be any forest approval granted. the Central Ministry of Environment has been attempting to get this decision of the Supreme Court rolled back in multiple different ways. And in recent months, we have seen a number of small orders being passed where Gram Sabha consent is not required for this category of projects and that category of projects and so on. Another area where we saw a very direct attack on the Forest Rights Act was last year when a proposed amendment to the Indian Forest Act was somehow sort of leaked into the public domain, and there was a complete uproar about it. And apart from the fact that those proposed amendments were planning to give enormous policing powers to the forest departments, what we also saw was that there were provisions that overrode the decisions by the Gram Sabhas and the mechanism for grant of rights and recognition of rights under the Forest Rights Act. Please give me a minute, I'll just drink some water. Fortunately, that amendment has not seen the light of day. But what we have also seen are repeated attempts to change the forest policy in order to bring private participation into the management and control over forests, which the existing forest policy of 1988, good God, does not permit. So these processes have been taking place over the last several years. We have been compelled to be hyper vigilant about developments that are taking place, both in terms of policy developments as well as implementation developments. But what is very, very alarming is that with the coronavirus pandemic, there have been some developments that have been completely, of course, because the entire media and everybody's attention is towards the lockdown, but there have been these small changes that have taken place, which have very far-reaching consequences. I will share with you just one of them, and I'm sure many of you are actually already familiar with this development. There has been an amendment brought to the Mines and Minerals Regulation and Development Act, which says that anybody who has an existing mining lease, if there is an existing mining lease that is expiring, then the new leaseholder will not be required to obtain any environmental or other clearances like forest clearances for a period of 2 years and can continue operations uninterrupted. Now, this is actually in many ways overturning the law laid down relating to mining, relating to environmental protection by the Supreme Court, by the National Green Tribunal. The statutory laws are completely being overturned because it's a very, very clear position of law that when the mining lease expires, and some of these mining leases are running into 25, 30 years, the leaseholder has to obtain all his all approvals de novo. Why is this important to us when we're talking about indigenous people's rights? It's because over the last 15, 20 years, it's been a laborious process of case by case, day by day, ensuring that the laws protect the rights of indigenous communities, forest dwellers, Adivasis to participate in decision making. And with the Niyamgiri judgment now, under the Forest Rights Act, you have to obtain the consent of the Gram Sabha before granting forest approval. Now, if a mining lease, which has been granted in 1998, is expiring today, what sense does it make to allow that leaseholder to continue mining operations without further approvals? How can there be a legal fiction that they have approvals? And this is one of the ways in which to get around the fact that you have to obtain consent from Gram Sabha. You have to obtain consent from local communities under the environment impact assessment through public hearings. So all this goes into the dustbin. And what I found actually very alarming when I was looking at this entire development was, and this is just one example, is that this idea has emerged from the Forest Advisory Committee set up under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. Now, the Forest Advisory Committee has a statutory role to play to grant forest approval or refuse forest approval on a case-to-case basis. The Forest Advisory Committee has no role to play in the development or making recommendations regarding changes in the law or in the changes relating to legal policy or environmental protection policy. So there is a series of minutes where the FAC is discussing these amendments to the Mines and Minerals Development Act. What business does it have to do that? And how can a statutory body set up under the FCA override decisions of the Supreme Court? This is something that is incomprehensible to me, and I think that one of the reasons why it hasn't actually met with the kind of public uproar that it deserves is because all of us are so fully absorbed in what is happening with the lockdowns and what's happening with the coronavirus and the health crisis that is there before us. I want to cut short what I have to say. I want to come to one very specific point, which is that along with this change in the law, which has, let me tell you, this amendment to the MMDR Act has been approved, and supporting notifications have been issued by the Ministry of Environment and Forest, and so on and so forth, and the whole thing is in process right now. What is also happening is that the FAC meetings are being held rapidly, granting approvals to diversion of forest lands over video conference. Now, according to me, it's a very good thing that we are able to do video conferences. We are able to have this meeting today, but there are certain things that cannot be done by video conference. One of these is granting approvals for forest diversion. And it is the FAC's duty to ensure that it has the complete information and makes informed decisions. And according to me, they're not making this kind of these informed decisions at a time when the economy is in a state of lockdown. Supply chains have been closed, transport chains have been closed, production is down to the bare minimum. What is the need to hurriedly grant approvals to large projects, which is going to result in diversion of forests from national parks and wildlife sanctuaries? One of the projects that they are planning to consider is, and some of you may have seen it on social media, is the Italin hydro project in the Dibang Valley in Arunachal Pradesh, which is going to result in cutting down 324,000 trees. What is the need to grant a clearance to a project of this size at this point of time? Is it related in any way to the health crisis that we are dealing with? And a number of such approvals have been granted. Now, just to conclude by saying that for the Adivasi and forest dwelling communities, going into shutdown at this point of time is actually a huge sacrifice, because in these 2-3 months of March, April, May, and even up to June are the 3-4 months in which 60 to 70% of the NTFPs for the entire year are harvested and sold. These are produce which are perishable. They cannot be stored easily. They need to be harvested and they need to be sold immediately so that they go into the markets. So even communities, even if they're able to, say for instance, pluck the mahua flowers, if they are not able to store them, by the time the lockdowns are lifted, those flowers will have rotted or they may have got fungus on them and they will not be able to obtain that kind of price. Now, but Adivasi communities, tribal communities, forest dwelling communities across the country are respecting the demand of the lockdown, which has come right from the very top. The very least that we can expect is that during this time when people have decided to stay home, stay safe, the government will at least not uh, take the legal structures or the legal protections, the constitutional protections that are there for indigenous people, and roll them back. At least one should have an expectation that the status quo should be maintained. Far from that, the government seems to be determined to roll back these protections and use the cover of the coronavirus lockdowns to do it at a time when people cannot have Gram Sabha meetings, people cannot take part in public hearings, and definitely people cannot come out in demonstrations or even approach the courts. One of the big problems that we are facing during this period is that the courts are closed. They're conducting hearings, yes, in urgent matters, but through e-filing and through video conference. Both are technology heavy, and they're not in the best of times. Courts are inaccessible to Adivasi and tribal communities. In the current situation, of course, they are even more inaccessible. So this is, yeah, I just need to, yeah, I just need to make one last point. I would urge you all to please read the judgment that has been passed 2 days ago by a 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court relating to reservations for teaching posts. And while I disagree with the finding, but one can understand that the court was very dismissive of 100% reservations for teachers in scheduled areas and has struck that part down. But what I find absolutely, well, difficult to understand, since this is being recorded, is the fact that repeatedly in the course of the judgment, the court has again and again said that there is a need to bring Adivasi and tribal communities into the mainstream. They need to be developed. They need to leave and keeps referring to them as primitive groups. And I think that I would here like to really reconnect with what Vandana has said earlier today, that we need to recognize as a nation that if there is a solution to climate change, to the coronavirus, to inequality, to a host of other things, solutions are there in front of us. They're with the Adivasi and the indigenous communities in this country. And it's time that we put aside the structural disrespect with which we treat them and start listening to them. And I think that this would be a useful lesson for the judiciary also in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Shomona and Vandana, for the talks. We have, like, as we had mentioned before, that the comments will be read out by the speakers separately. But there are a few questions for both of you. And so to begin with, uh, let me just, yeah. So for Vandana, like people are wondering if there are further suggested readings on the ideas that you discussed in your talk. Then we have someone asking that there is a sort of incommensurability, surability between indigenous people's knowledge systems and modern science. At least this is how the international law constructs the relationship between the two. For example, Paris Agreement maintains a hierarchy between the two where modern science is given preference over indigenous knowledge systems. In this case, do you think there is a possibility of reconciliation between modern science and indigenous knowledge systems? So I would think that Vandana, you could first respond to the questions and then I will read out the set of questions for Shomona. Does that work?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to keep my responses brief. So yes, there is an incommensurability, and if I had more time, I'd go into the history of science, particularly my discipline, to bring out that difference. I have come across one case in Alaska when I went to develop a case study on climate change to the North Shore of Alaska, where the native peoples there, the Inupiaq people of the North Shore, have been living in that environment for thousands of years. And I came across a unique, what seemed to me an egalitarian relationship between scientists at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks and native elders. They often, I found that some of them were actually co-publishing in peer-reviewed journals. And it turns out that this is a 30-year lesson that was taught to the scientists by the indigenous people, because the scientists initially went full of, the usual scientific, like I know best and whatnot kind of attitudes, and found to their surprise that not only did indigenous people have knowledge about the environment that was beyond the knowledge of the scientists, but they had a way of reasoning about it and drawing conclusions that was also beyond the understanding of the scientists or the knowledge of the scientists at that time. So actually what is lacking in one sense in science as we know it, because it came from a certain socio-cultural context, so we're talking about Galileo in Italy, we're talking about Isaac Newton in the 1600s in the UK, comes from a certain historical context. And the things that are missing in it are actually some of them, indigenous knowledge provides a complementarity and a corrective to scientific knowledge. So there's actually a great deal of potential in the two working together. And as I said, I know of at least one case that seems relatively successful. Thank you for that question.
Yeah. So Shomona, you have quite a few. So when you say that 14% got rights at the individual level and 3% at the community level, do you mean 14% of the cases or households? Could you clarify and expand on this? The second question is, can you comment on the barriers to the community rights? Also, have there been case studies as to how the forests are doing where community rights have been granted? Can they be exemplars? Then how are you estimating the potential rights granted over forest land in terms of area of land or percentage of Adivasi population for whom the said rights have been recognized? Uh, would you like to answer these three? There are a couple of more questions, or should I read out all of them at one go? Shomona?
Yeah. Uh, see, these are all estimates. For years, in the early years of the enactment of Forest Rights Act, we tried to find out how many forest dwellers are there in this country. And we don't have the numbers, and there is no logical way of finding out the numbers of forest dwellers or forest dependent families. As far as the Forest Rights Act is concerned, we can make estimates and say that 8.5% of the population is scheduled tribe, and say another 10-12% will be forest dwellers who are not scheduled tribes, so it comes to around 20. But these are all back of the envelope calculations. The Rights and Resources Initiative has actually done a study on the land available, and the potential land over which forest rights should be granted. And there too, their estimate is very, it's based on very narrow parameters, and they have based their estimates on the census of India 2011 data to see which are the villages in the country which are located only on forest land. So they don't have any revenue land. So they've just based it on that. Actually, it could be much higher, but based on those figures, if you look at the Ministry of Tribal Affairs data on the number of claims that have been filed, the number of claims that have been approved, and over how much area of land, then it comes to around 10 to 12%. It's not 14% actually. As far as individual forest rights are concerned, there too, the actual figure may be lower because the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, along with all the state governments, actually calculates a claim which has been partially rejected, in the sense that a person may have claimed for 2 acres and has got a forest rights certificate for say half an acre as an approved claim. So, so it puts it in the plus numbers. Whereas very often for the person who's the claimant, it's in his claim has been rejected. So these are estimates, and they are probably on the higher side. As far as the 3% CFR areas is concerned, that is also using the same kind of methodology. One of the reasons, of course, why CFR recognition has been very poor is because at the beginning of the implementation of the Forest Rights Act, the state administration itself focused on granting individual forest rights. And there was this huge hullabaloo about, distributing the forms for the individual rights first. And even at that point of time, when village communities who were a little more knowledgeable, they had a little more information, they demanded that the CFR claim forms be given to them. They were told that the forms have not been printed. So I remember it was that point of time, a number of requests coming to me where I would just simply cut and paste it from the act itself and the rules and then forward it to whoever. But how many people actually approach a Supreme Court lawyer that too for a form? So that's been one reason. The other reason, of course, has been that there has been a lot of resistance from within the state machinery to the grant of CFR rights. CFRs have been routinely rejected for a host of completely illegal reasons, such as these areas have been earmarked for coal mining, so therefore CFR cannot be granted, or these areas have already been given to JFM committees, so CFR cannot be granted. And so on and so forth. There are a wide variety of reasons why CFRs have been rejected. But having said that, within that 3%, there are numerous really amazing examples of how village communities have invested time, invested money, invested thought and creativity into making those resources more robust. Everybody's heard about the Menda Lekha example, but there are a number of examples from across the country where people have regenerated their forests, and because they feel a sense of security, a tenurial security, and they have the patta, they are able to assert their right to protect those forests. And to the extent that there have been instances where in those same CFR forest lands, when the forest department officials have come to do their routine coop felling, the village communities have stopped them from cutting those trees, even though they don't have any rights in the timber. So they recognize the fact that a forest is not the trees and is not the timber, and there is a whole host, a whole ecosystem around those trees and the forest. And just because they don't own the trees, doesn't mean that that forest doesn't belong to them. So this is a very important development. If I can also share some of these readings if people are interested.
Yeah, so Shomona, just to like link it to the last question you answered, in Kerala, the Supreme Court took the decision to order demolition of a building or buildings which were constructed in protected coastal areas, coastal zones, and taken action against the builders. So why have more PILs not been filed to protect the rights of the village forest committees or the rights of Adivasis in this or some other way?
What is the question? Why have not more PILs been filed?
Yeah, to
Yeah.
protect the rights of the
Well,
Adivasis.
see, public interest litigation is another story, and we could probably have another webinar on that. Um, I think that one of the reasons why Adivasi communities do not approach the courts in the way, say, people like you and I do, is precisely because of the kind of observations that they get from like I read out to you. I wanted to read out to you actually about Adivasis being continuously referred to in a Supreme Court judgment written by 5 judges as primitive and this and that. Human zoo, dance performances. So this is the kind of language that they use. And my own experience with litigation in the Supreme Court and in other courts when we've been compelled to go in for litigation is that the question is invariably framed as a tribals versus development, as if there is no space for the two to come together, or the fact that Adivasi communities may perceive development differently from the mainstream or the hegemonic cultural worldview on what is development, and that perception may be absolutely valid. So it's continuously, and I know a number of my colleagues who are environmental lawyers are constantly being told that they are against development, they're anti-development, and sometimes they're even called anti-national. So it is not surprising when the judges themselves and the judicial system has this kind of a mindset and has closed its imagination to the way indigenous peoples view their resources. Very few people actually go to court. When they do, it is a massive struggle. It's a huge struggle, and all kinds of creative ways have to be used to open the minds of the judges to a new way of thinking.
Thanks, Shomona. So there is a question which we would like both you and Vandana to answer. And Vandana, you're yet to your talk was interesting and people would like to know more, what some suggested reading. So if you could talk a bit about that. So the question for both of you would be like, there has been a complex expansion of capitalism in Indian agriculture for the last 20 years or so. It makes a commodity, like capitalism makes, including forests, via Campa or Red Plus. What does this do to Adivasi or forest dependent societies in terms of their relationship with forests? And how are these communities changing as a consequence? So, I mean, this is a question probably to like both Vandana and you. So, who'd like to go first? For
Shomona, why don't you go ahead and then I'll follow up briefly.
Actually, Vandana, it might be better if you answer this question first, because uh, it's actually a longish answer, and I don't want to take up more time on this. Why don't you do that?
Okay, I'll just say briefly what I do directly know about and what I've studied is actually the Alaskan Inupiaq people at the north shore of Alaska, at the edge of the Arctic Ocean. And there the the capitalism has and colonialism have a long history there. And in fact, it's very interesting, that's one reason I asked the question about the community rights, is that the notion of ownership of land is a bizarre one, especially private ownership to the Inupiaq people, because they have this sense of belonging to the land, not the land belonging to them. But in any case, long story short, ultimately the intrusion of capitalism and capitalist lifestyles and the dependence on the oil economy, which is also the thing that's destroying the environment and culture, has resulted in dividing the community, which is very tragic, because these communities value consensus very much. So there are people who are very gung-ho on, development and oil drilling in the Arctic, and think that they can protect the wildlife that they still depend on for sustenance from the oil industry. And then there are people who say, no, we can't do this. This is what's destroying us. And there's actually been a lawsuit among two groups in this community. So it's actually been a very tragic and divisive thing, the intrusion of capitalist ways of thinking. But please, Shomona, it's your turn now. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to say we have like 5 more minutes,
Okay.
and there's just one more last question that we'd like to ask you. So just be quick. Thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to go into details. I think the answer that Vandana has given is really perfect. In India, as far as Campa is concerned, the problem is that there is this huge amount of money. It's upwards of 60,000 crores. And after the Supreme Court gave permission last year, the money has been sent to the state governments. And what the state governments very often are doing is to deploy these funds for so-called compensatory afforestation plantations through the joint forest management committees. And when that happens, you create a divide inside the community, because the village forest rights committee under the Forest Rights Act has no funding, has no resources other than whatever it's releasing through its own enterprise. And then suddenly you have lakhs of rupees coming into the Joint Forest Management Committee for plantations. And they abuse this power. During the lockdown, we have come across several instances where, and reports have come in where Campa plantations have been done on lands belonging to particularly vulnerable tribal groups, forcibly planted and fencing done. This theft, but it's happening.
Okay, so our last question is, and you are free to like not answer it, but would either of you like to comment on the eco-fascist narrative going around the whole COVID-19 thing? How right or how wrong is the statement that, humans are the virus? So if like either of you have any comment to make regarding that?
Well, I can go briefly. So are you talking, just to clarify, are you talking about the notion that, humans are the scourge on earth, and
Yeah.
that, we are the bad guys, right? I think I disagree with that in one sense that, people don't see systems. Systems are not always visible. And that's why I tried to portray systems in a visible way, through that pyramid of inequality, for instance. It's the system that's the problem, and we are enmeshed in that system. So I think it's perfectly possible. In fact, the existence of indigenous people over millennia shows that it's perfectly possible for humans to coexist harmoniously, more or less, because they have been, indigenous people also have an environmental record that's not perfect, but it's far, far, far better than that of modern industrial civilization. That doesn't mean that there are only two choices, that you either live like indigenous people or we live the way we do. That's why I say that this is a problem of the imagination. There are a whole lot of, there's an infinity of choices, I think we have a lot to learn from indigenous people, but we can also think about, and I try to do that in my fiction, create worlds where you have other possibilities. And so I think that, you know, we've lost our sense of belonging to the planet. And we feel that, you know, perhaps as this internal, deep internal, half-hidden angst or something. And to get it back, that means, of course, doing away with capitalism and these ways of living and being. But there are other possibilities, and like I said, so yeah, so that's all I'll say on the subject.
Shomona, would you like to quickly say something? We have
Yeah, I
1
think
minute.
that's pretty much a perfect answer. I don't think I have anything to add. Only experientially, I can tell you that when I take the Forest Rights Act into the courtroom and try to explain it to the courts, very often the judges, the other lawyers, they're just not able to understand it at all. They can't understand that worldview. And when I take a complex legislation like the Forest Rights Act to the field, to Adivasi communities, to panchayat members, people who are illiterate even, they get it like that. So I don't think I agree with this eco-fascist thing.
Okay. So, thank you for coming to our webinar and for this really interesting talk. Our next session is on Tuesday, 28th April at 12 p.m., where we'll be talking with A. Revati, Raj Merchant, and Chainika Shah on the experiences of the queer and trans communities. And please do join us tomorrow. And thank you so much for joining us today. So,
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Shomona. Learned a lot.
Vandana,
yeah.
thank you, Vandana. Thanks everybody for being here. Bye-bye. Thanks, Anuradha.
Bye. Bye.